In 1940, Britain came within 3 votes of making peace with Adolf Hitler. The government hid this from the public for 50 years. May 1940. Germany has overrun France. The British army is trapped at Dunkirk. London is preparing for invasion. And inside the most secret room in Britain, the government is about to make a decision that will determine the fate of the world. 5 men sit around this table. The future of Western civilization is the item on the agenda. They have been arguing for 5 days, and the vote is about to happen. His name was Lord Edward Halifax, Foreign Secretary, War Cabinet member, the most respected diplomat in Britain. And he believed, with complete conviction, that Winston Churchill was about to lead the country into total destruction. Churchill had been Prime Minister for 11 days. He had inherited a war that was going catastrophically wrong, and in the room he now controlled, the most powerful men in his government were telling him to stop fighting. As the cabinet argued, 338,000 British and Allied soldiers were stranded on a French beach. Their survival, and with it Britain's ability to fight at all, hung on both the evacuation and the political decision happening simultaneously in London. Churchill knew what he was facing, not just military collapse, but the collapse of the political will to resist. And if that will broke in the cabinet, it would break everywhere. This is the story of 5 days in May 1940 when the fate of Britain, and of the free world, was decided not on a battlefield, but in a room, by a conversation, by 3 votes. In 6 weeks, Adolf Hitler had achieved what the entire German military had failed to do in 4 years of the First World War. Western Europe was collapsing at a speed that defied comprehension. France, the largest army in Western Europe, the ally that Britain had depended on for its continental defense, was gone. The German army had simply driven around the defensive line and France had shattered. The British public was being told the army was being evacuated. What they were not being told was that the cabinet was simultaneously debating whether Britain should fight on at all. Intelligence reports arriving in London were uniformly catastrophic. Division after division of the French army was surrendering, encircled, or in full retreat. Every hour, the situation worsened. British intelligence knew that Germany expected Britain to negotiate. Hitler's generals were already writing internal memos assuming that once France fell, a British peace settlement was the logical next step. Neville Chamberlain, the man who had given Hitler Czechoslovakia at Munich in 1938, resigned as Prime Minister on May 10, 1940. The same day Germany began its assault on France. Churchill took power into the worst possible situation. Churchill's cabinet was not his cabinet. It contained Chamberlain, who had appeased Hitler. It contained Halifax, who believed Churchill's belligerence was suicidal. These men had not been defeated. They still believed they were right. Hitler in May 1940 was at the absolute height of his power and confidence. He had just achieved something extraordinary. He now expected Britain to recognize reality, and he was genuinely surprised when Churchill refused to. 22 miles of water. That was all that separated Hitler's army from Britain in May 1940. And if the cabinet's debate went the wrong way, even those 22 miles would not have mattered. Lord Halifax believed the evidence was overwhelming. Britain could not win. France was gone. America was neutral. Russia was allied with Germany. The rational course, the course Halifax argued for with great precision, was to negotiate before total defeat. Halifax was not a coward. He was not a Nazi sympathizer. He was a man who had looked at the military situation with cold realism and concluded that fighting on was a catastrophic gamble that would destroy Britain even if it ultimately succeeded. Without Churchill's knowledge, Halifax had already made contact. He had approached the Italian ambassador, Count Bastianini, to ask whether Mussolini might arrange a peace conference between Britain and Germany. Italy was not yet in the war. Mussolini was watching and waiting. Halifax believed that if Britain asked for mediation quickly, terms could be negotiated before Italy entered the war on Germany's side, giving Britain a better deal than it would get later. The War Cabinet meetings of May 26 to 28, 1940, 3 days, 5 sessions, were the most consequential political debates in British history. Churchill and Halifax argued across the mahogany table with everything at stake. Churchill understood that the argument was not really about military strategy. It was about will. If Britain's government publicly signaled willingness to negotiate, the will to resist would collapse. In the army, in the public, and in the neutral nations watching to decide which side to support. Halifax's argument was not without force. He told the cabinet, "We must not ignore the fact that we might get better terms before France goes out of the war and before we have been seriously weakened." It was a rational argument made in a moment when rationality was its own form of surrender. Halifax proposed that Britain approach Mussolini with a specific question. What terms might Germany offer? Not surrender, just exploration, just talk, just finding out what Hitler wanted. Attlee and Greenwood, the Labour members of the coalition cabinet, supported Churchill. Without them, the vote would have gone differently. The men who had most opposed rearmament in the 1930s now voted to fight. Churchill told the cabinet, "Nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished." He was not arguing strategy. He was arguing the nature of a people and a civilization. Churchill's masterstroke was political, not military. He broke out of the war cabinet and spoke to the full outer cabinet, 25 ministers who had not been part of the debate. He told them the situation plainly and asked for their support. He told them, "I am convinced that every man of you would rise up and tear me down from my place if I were for one moment to contemplate parley or surrender." The room erupted. Several ministers wept. They came to him one by one. Churchill walked back into the war cabinet meeting changed. He now had explicit emotional support from the wider government, and Halifax knew it. The political ground had shifted in the time Churchill had been out of the room. 5 days. The cabinet met 5 times, each session more desperate, more heated than the last. And outside the windows of Downing Street, the news from France got worse with every hour. On day 3 of the cabinet debate, the Dunkirk evacuation was in full swing. Every hour, ships brought men back across the channel. Whether those men would ever fight again depended entirely on what Churchill could keep the cabinet from agreeing to. The miracle at Dunkirk was happening as the peace negotiation debate continued. Churchill used every updated rescue figure as ammunition. Each man brought back was evidence that Britain still had something worth fighting with. Halifax's position was now explicit. He was willing to cede British territory, Malta, Gibraltar colonies, to get a negotiated settlement. To Churchill, this was not a starting position. It was surrender described in diplomatic language. Churchill faced a political paradox. Halifax was too powerful to directly destroy. His resignation would bring down the coalition and hand Britain's fate to appeasers. Churchill had to change Halifax's mind, or outlast him. In the evenings, Churchill walked. He processed the arguments, refined his positions, found the language that might move men who were not moved by passion. He was fighting a war inside a room and a war across the channel simultaneously. Halifax wrote in his diary that Churchill's refusal to negotiate was the most extraordinary exhibition of futile obstinacy. He still believed completely that the war was lost and that Churchill was leading Britain to total destruction. Chamberlain's support for Halifax began to waver on day 4. He had been the great appeaser, the man who had believed in negotiation with Hitler. But he watched what was happening at Dunkirk, and something shifted. May 28, 1940. The final cabinet session. Halifax arrived, still committed to his position. Churchill arrived knowing that if he did not win today, the debate would continue until public and political morale made the outcome inevitable. Churchill's final argument was not geopolitical. It was existential. If this Long Island story is to end, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. The room went silent. When the moment came, the vote was 3-2 against exploring peace negotiations. Churchill, yes. Attlee, yes. Greenwood, yes. Halifax, no. Chamberlain, whose abstention effectively decided the outcome, shifted from Halifax's position. Halifax accepted the defeat with the impassivity of a man who had been in politics long enough to know that today's decision could be reversed. He did not resign. He did not publicly break. He waited. Outside the cabinet room, the world continued unaware that it had just been changed by 3 votes and a conversation no one would know about for 50 years. The men leaving Dunkirk did not know that on the same day they were rescued, a vote had been taken in London that guaranteed they would fight again. Churchill had preserved not just lives, but purpose. 338,000 men returned from Dunkirk. Not a victory, Churchill said so explicitly, but a miracle, and the miracle of one decision. 3 votes in a cabinet room, and the army came home to fight. Churchill had won the argument. He had not won the war. He had simply given Britain the chance to fight it. What happened next would depend on every resource, military, industrial, psychological, that Britain could summon. The cabinet minutes from May 26 to 28, 1940 were immediately classified at the highest level. The British government had decided that the public must never know how close the surrender debate had come. After the war, the records were systematically sealed. Under the 30-year rule, they could be opened in 1970. But specific categories, including cabinet discussions about peace negotiations, were extended under separate classification. When the 30-year rule allowed the first wartime records to be released in the 1970s, the most sensitive cabinet meetings were still withheld. The gap in the archives was noticeable. Questions were asked. Official answers were evasive. Historians spent decades reconstructing the story from fragments. Halifax's diaries, participants' memoirs, Foreign Office files, cross-referencing gaps. The picture was assembled piece by piece before the cabinet minutes themselves were released. When the cabinet minutes were finally released, after more than 50 years, they confirmed what historians had suspected and the government had suppressed. Britain's war cabinet had seriously debated surrender in the darkest days of 1940. When the story broke into the public record, the reaction was exactly what the post-war government had feared: disbelief, anger, and a profound reassessment of what 1940 had actually been. Not the heroic certainty of propaganda, but a genuinely contested decision. Halifax lived until 1959, long enough to see that Churchill's choice had led to Allied victory. He never publicly admitted the full extent of what he had proposed in those May cabinet meetings. He died with the official record still sealed. The cabinet war rooms in London are now a museum. Millions of tourists walk through the spaces where these decisions were made. Until the 1990s, many of those visitors were not told the full story of what had been debated in those rooms. The exact words in the cabinet minutes, when finally released, were more stark than any dramatization. The calm official language of diplomacy describing the potential surrender of Western civilization. The National Archives at Kew holds the records. They are accessible now to any researcher, any historian, any citizen who wants to read them. The cabinet minutes of May 26, 28, 1940 are available. The secret is out. It was agreed that His Majesty's government should not approach Signor Mussolini. 11 words. The formal record of the decision that kept Britain fighting and eventually helped bring about the defeat of Nazi Germany. For generations of British schoolchildren, the story of 1940 was simple. Britain stood alone and Churchill never wavered. The released documents told a more complicated, more human, and ultimately more extraordinary story. If Halifax had won, if those 3 votes had gone differently, the consequences were not speculative. They were calculable, and they were catastrophic. A British peace settlement in May 1940 would have made permanent Nazi dominion over continental Europe. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, all occupied, all without the Allied return that eventually came. Without Britain's continued resistance, the United States would have had no base of operations in Europe, no British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, no transatlantic supply routes. D-Day would not have been possible. There would have been nowhere to launch it from. The final solution was in its planning stages in May 1940. 6 million Jewish people were murdered between 1941 and 1945. Without Allied victory, the killing would not have stopped. A British peace settlement would have left the death camps to run to completion. D-Day, June 6, 1944, was the direct consequence of Churchill's 3 votes in May 1940. Without those 3 votes, no Britain in the war, no American base in Europe, no D-Day. The liberation of Europe would not have happened. Every American soldier who landed on Normandy in June 1944 was there because of what Churchill had prevented in May 1940. A decision made in a room with 5 men reached, 4 years later, the beaches of France. The liberation of Paris, the end of the Holocaust, the Nuremberg trials, the founding of the United Nations, the reconstruction of Europe under the Marshall Plan. All of these things trace a direct line back to what was decided in the cabinet room on May 28, 1940. The survivors of the Holocaust are the most direct human evidence of what Churchill's vote preserved. Without Allied victory, there would have been no liberation of the camps. The knowledge of what happened would not have survived either. Nuremberg, the first war crimes tribunal in history, was only possible because the Allies won. If Britain had made peace in 1940, there would have been no Nuremberg. The architects of the Holocaust would have lived out their lives in power. The free world that exists today, its institutions, its democracies, its international law, its human rights conventions, all of it required Allied victory. All of Allied victory required Britain to keep fighting. 3 votes. 3 people. 3 votes. 3 voices raised in a cabinet meeting that most of the world did not know had happened. Against them, the perfectly rational argument that Britain was beaten and that fighting on was a gamble with civilization. Churchill's "We shall fight on the beaches" speech, given 6 days after the cabinet vote, was addressed to the public. But its real audience was the war itself, every enemy listening to British radio, every ally calculating whether Britain would hold. Halifax served Britain loyally after his defeat in the cabinet. He became one of the most effective British ambassadors Washington has ever had. He never publicly discussed the May 1940 debate. Churchill won the war, he won the argument, he won history's verdict. And then, in July 1945, the British electorate voted him out of office before the war with Japan was even over. Democracies have complicated relationships with their saviors. Churchill later wrote that the May 1940 cabinet crisis had been the moment he feared most during the entire war. Not because of the military situation, but because of the political situation inside his own cabinet. The Churchill War Rooms are now one of London's most visited museums. The cabinet table where the vote was taken is preserved. The room is cold and low-ceilinged and smells of history. Millions of people have sat in it and not known the full story of what happened there. Historians continue to debate Halifax's position. Some argue that his logic was not wrong, that Britain was in a desperate situation and negotiation might have been the rational choice. The counter-argument is that rationality and survival are not always the same thing. The 3 votes that saved Britain were not all Churchill's. Attlee and Arthur Greenwood, Labour men, voted with him. Without the Labour members of the coalition cabinet, Churchill's position would not have held. The Germany that exists today, democratic, peaceful, a founding member of the European Union, was made possible only by Germany's total defeat. Total defeat required Allied victory. Allied victory required Churchill to hold his cabinet in May 1940. The entire post-war international order, NATO, the European project, the UN Security Council, the Geneva Conventions, was built on the assumption that Nazism had been defeated, not accommodated. Halifax's deal would have produced a different foundation. The documents are now displayed in museums and taught in schools. The secret is part of history. The question they raise, about leadership, about rationality versus conviction, about when to fight and when to negotiate, has not been resolved. The choice Churchill made in 1940 is not unique to 1940. Every generation faces its version of the question, when is negotiation wisdom, and when is it surrender dressed in diplomatic language? Stand on the cliffs of Dover today and look toward France. In May 1940, the opposite view was of German-occupied Europe. The Channel was the only thing between Britain and a Nazi continent. 3 votes kept it that way. The most famous face of the 20th century. The bulldog expression. The confidence of resistance. But the private Churchill, the Churchill of the cabinet debates, was not certain. He was determined. Those are not the same thing. The House of Commons was bombed in 1941. Churchill insisted it be rebuilt exactly as before, saying that its intimate, confrontational design was essential to British democracy. The room he had fought to protect continued to shape the country he had fought to save. Churchill's public legacy is enormous. His private legacy, what he did in 5 days of cabinet meetings in May 1940, against men who were not wrong about the military situation and were wrong about everything else, is the greater one. The lesson of May 1940 is not simply never negotiate with dictators. The lesson is more precise and more difficult. Some situations are defined not by the military math, but by the moral stakes. And sometimes the rational calculation and the necessary decision point in opposite directions. Halifax was not stupid. He was not cowardly. He had the better military argument. What he lacked was Churchill's understanding that some fights are not about winning. They are about who you are and what you will become if you do not fight. The people who benefit most from Churchill's 3 votes are the people who never knew about them, the billions who have lived in a post-Nazi-dominated world, who have had the option of ordinary freedom without knowing what it cost to preserve. Every person who learns this story has the same experience. The world you assumed was inevitable becomes a world that almost wasn't. That shift, from inevitability to contingency, is one of the most important things history can teach. You can put your hands on that table today. The same table, the same room, the same floor where Churchill's feet rested when he made the argument that changed history. The past is not as far as it seems. 5 signatures on cabinet minutes that were hidden for 50 years. The signatures of the men who, between them, in a single vote, determined the course of Western history for the next 80 years. Britain held, not because victory was certain, not because the military situation was favorable, but because 3 men in a cabinet meeting made a choice that could not be justified by the evidence available to them at the time, only by the values they refused to compromise. 22 miles of water, the channel that did not need to be defended, because the cabinet vote meant there was still an army and a nation and a will to defend it. Every student who hears this story is hearing the history of the world they live in. The world that was preserved in 5 days of argument by 5 men in a basement room in May 1940. This is not ancient history. It is the foundation of the present. Churchill was not perfect. He made terrible decisions in other theaters of the war. He held views we rightly find repugnant today. He was a man of his time and class with all the limitations that implies. And in May 1940, he did the one thing history required of him, and he did it exactly right. The cenotaph honors the dead of both world wars. Among those deaths, the soldiers at D-Day, the men at El Alamein, the sailors of the Atlantic convoys, are the direct consequences of the decision to fight. Death chosen over surrender, honor chosen over safety. Halifax's name appears in official records as a distinguished diplomat and statesman. His role in the May 1940 cabinet debate was, for decades, one of Britain's most carefully kept secrets. History is more complicated than the stories we tell about it. The Houses of Parliament. The building that Hitler planned to repurpose after the British surrender that never happened. Still standing, still hosting the arguments and votes that Churchill understood were worth dying for. 3 votes to 2. That was the margin. That was the distance between the world we live in and a world under Nazi dominion. The smallest majority in the history of consequential decisions. Britain is still here, free, imperfect, still arguing, as democracies do. Still here because of 5 days in May 1940 and 3 votes and 1 man's refusal to accept that the evidence, however overwhelming, was the whole story. And the question that leaves is this: when your civilization asks something of you, what will your vote be? Tell us in the comments.